Hello, I'm Dan Sweeney, the Director of the Institute for Enterprise Ethics at the Daniels College of Business on the University of Denver campus. I'm pleased to present to you today the Quarterly Ethics Review for Spring 2018. The episode will cover 3 of the most interesting stories regarding corporate ethics, integrity, and responsibility over the past 3 months. Specifically, we will discuss the Facebook personal data breach, we'll discuss the opioid crisis, and we will discuss the Theranos $800 million fraud. We have 3 outstanding faculty representatives join us to help us understand these questions and maybe find some solutions. Professor Rosanna Garcia is Associate Professor of Marketing and holds the Walter Koch Chair of Entrepreneurship at the Daniels College of Business. Professor Jack Buffington, Assistant Professor of the Practice in Supply Chain Management in the Marketing Department at the Daniels College of Business, and Research Professor for the University College, both at the University of Denver. Professor Vi Nera-Peretti is Associate Professor in the Department of Management at the Daniels College of Business. So let's get on with the discussion. On March 25, 2018, Mark Zuckerberg, CEO of Facebook, published a personal letter in various newspapers around the country apologizing on behalf of Facebook for allowing a consulting company called Cambridge Analytica to have access to the personal information of some 84 million Facebook users. Zuckerberg first apologized for the situation on CNN, calling it an issue, a mistake, and a breach of trust. Zuckerberg pledged to 2 congressional committees to make changes and reforms in the Facebook policy to prevent similar breaches. So, Rosanna, how did such a massive data crisis come about for such a seemingly very sophisticated company such as Facebook? Do you believe it was, as Zuckerberg first said, merely an issue, a mistake, or a breach of trust? Or alternatively, might it have been an intentional and purposeful strategy to feed the advertising business model? Or another case may have been simple naivete on the part of Mr. Zuckerberg, his executive team, and his board of directors. So what do you think happened here, Rosanna?
Yeah, that's a really great question, Dan. And so I approach this from a perspective not only as a marketing and business professor, but with an interest in technology with my engineering background. So that's definitely the perspective I'm going to take. I don't see it being a mistake. I don't see it as the company being naive, but I do see the foundation on where he started the company, which was in his dorm room at Harvard, being idealistic and optimistic about what he could contribute. And what he felt at that time with his co-founders, that he could contribute and build a community, that there wasn't any other way right now at that time for people to interact with each other. And when he reported to Congress, one of the things he did talk about was the Me Too movement and how Facebook was instrumental in being able to build that particular movement and other movements along the lines. And so that's where the idealistic perspective comes in, that's really what he was trying to do, and that's what he built. And so he has great gratification in building that. The second side of it, and so this is when it becomes this now, we have a 2-sided market. And he also has said that this is a business about advertising. He has said that. And so this is how the company makes money. And now we have that 2-sided market where you have consumers who are benefiting from a community that's been built, but it's being paid for by advertisers. And so who do you end up serving? And that's where it comes into, I think, that he forgot about that community building, and instead we're making decisions focused on looking at delivering services to his customers, who are advertisers. And so it wasn't so much about, building the coffers, it was meeting the needs of your customer. And so that's my marketing side coming out. And the customers were looking for a way of advertising. Now, with the breach of trust, I can see that he would say it came from Cambridge Analytica, because what they did, and this is where the mistrust, the scandal part comes in, if you want to talk about there being a scandal, is on not so much how they collected the data, but what they did with that data after they obtained it. And what they did is they actually went out and collected data from friends of others. And then they used that data, and as we are told, and there's still, there's some controversy, did this actually happen or not? Did they actually use that data for being able to target political advertisements? So kind of, bottom line, he was out serving the needs of a community he had built and the needs of his customers.
Jack, what do you think?
I think data breaching is a problem, but I think there's a bigger problem with this company. Now, full disclosure, there's 2.1 billion Facebook users in the world. I'm one of the 5 billion who are not, or conversely, one of the 5 Americans who are not. So I'm not a Facebook user, but a survey that I saw from Reuters from April showed that out of the 6 largest social media outlets, most people use Facebook more than the others, and yet of those same respondents, they have the least confidence in Facebook, only 20%. This is a company who's grown its profits in the first quarter by almost 50%. Users over 2.4 billion. So the question is, why aren't users concerned about this? Why is this an issue? And there's a bigger problem with why that's, I think, is the case. If you look at how Facebook brings users to their site, they're using the same methods that online casinos are using in order to create this social addiction, which I think is the bigger problem than the data breach. The bigger problem of Facebook, in compared to a casino, is you don't have to be 21 years old to use Facebook. So they're creating this model of social addiction that I think is a greater concern that some researchers are comparing to drug addiction. And that's the reason why I think there's so many consumers who are not concerned about this data breach, and that's why I think that's the bigger problem.
And a couple of points you bring up there, Jack. I am a Facebook user, and I'm going to go out there and tell you one of the reasons why it's so important for me, and it's to be able to connect with my family. I had a nephew who died by suicide, and if I had been in touch with him, then we think we would have had a better understanding of what was going on in his life. So I'm a real big fan of it for that community building. But you make the point that, the data privacy. And I know that whatever I put out there on Facebook, it's public. It goes out to everybody. And I think most Americans that do this, and there's going to be some that don't understand, know that. And so putting out that data means I know how it's going to be used, and I don't have a concern about it. And so I think you're saying people do have concerns about it, and I'm thinking maybe they don't.
But I think, sorry,
No,
but one other point to make is I think you're right about that, but the fact that it's being advertised and sent out to people who are under 21 is a real concern. And this social media addiction is becoming a real problem. People who can't drive cars, can't drink alcohol, are having their data out there, and it's becoming a problem.
As a strategy professor, I feel that both of you have valid points, which is, those that are not concerned actually are users, and are almost addicted to it, as I know some of my family members are. And those of us who are actually a little bit more careful about what is put out there and what the company is doing with it tend not to use it. So we have two different kinds of people here. But again, I think Mr. Zuckerberg wasn't naive. I agree with you totally. I think he's brilliant, first of all. I think he was under considerable pressure to grow his business and grow the revenue side. And he somehow felt that probably he was the gatekeeper of all this information and felt that it may not come out. So I don't think he saw how this will actually blow up in his face. And you probably know that the EU Commission has asked him to meet them and he's agreed to meet them in just a few days, but he denies requests from the UK to go there. He says he will never go there. And so it is very interesting as to why that is.
My guess is the reason because of GDRP. And so GDRP is called the General Data Protection Regulation, which is effective of May 25th out of this year. And it is being pushed by the UK. In that particular protection, it says that every consumer has digital rights, and they have a right to knowing how their data is going to be used. They have a right to disappear. And so that's what I think is interesting. A right to be forgotten is what they call it. And so this is where I think the real issue is. It becomes an issue of transparency. That, to me, is the biggest issue that is being faced with. And Facebook doesn't tell you what they're not transparent.
That's right.
And so if that's anything that's happening, I think that's the biggest issue, Dan, is one around transparency. That they do believe they're serving their customers, but they're forgetting about who those people are. And if they're transparent about it, that I'm going to use your data for this reason, we're collecting data, and Cambridge Analytica also was not transparent on how that data was going to be used.
Let me make a comment here. I think that Facebook is a very naive company. I think they had no idea that there were evil forces out there that could come and do some real damage to the Facebook users. Now, if he's so concerned about his users, he should have been on top of that. Unfortunately, there's nobody in their top echelon of executives, there's nobody on their board of directors that had any experience whatsoever running a big, complicated, global, high-technology company. In fact, there was nobody on the board or in the executive team that had any experience running any kind of a company except a technology company. And you can look down the list. There was no risk officer. There was no compliance officer. This is a company all of whose directors are from Silicon Valley. Most of them were major venture capital investors and maintain a huge stake in Facebook. There was nobody around that table to give them any counsel or advice about what actually goes on in this big complicated economy that we've got this complicated business operating in. And they were just blindsided. They shouldn't have been blindsided. A $40 billion company should not be blindsided.
I don't know if I would call it, I agree with B. I don't think he was naive. I think he chose to be ignorant and not understand what the potential impact was that he and Facebook is having on being able to market in a way that influences people. And you talk about addiction. And so is he propagating this addiction? I think it's something they choose to be ignorant about because, again, from that pure business marketing side, he has got two markets. He's got customers like me that are happy to share the information. I want the data. And he's got advertisers that are happy to pay him to get access to people like me. And so, yeah, I'm going to ignore what I think you bring up some very important issues about what is the real impact.
Well, there's a term that's different than ignorant called plausible deniability that I'm going to talk about. So it's just, ignorant seems so much of a kind word. And I think as a CEO, you're not allowed to be ignorant, especially for a $40 billion company.
Well, he needs some people around his executive table and his board table to tell him what he needs to pay attention to. Another thing he needs to pay attention to. He's got a big job. He got to do the whole thing. That's my view.
And I agree with you there. I do think it is something that every company should have that's dealing with data is what is the risk? Not the risk to the company, but the risk to your stakeholders.
Yep, I agree. And I think he didn't do it.
And
He had nobody to tell him to do it. Yeah.
Well, remember, he's very optimistic.
Yes.
Right?
Yeah.
So then, if he probably thought that, well, if I get caught, I'm going to ask for people's pardon.
Yes.
But I think that's Dan's
see?
point.
Yeah.
If you're very optimistic, you need to have a board of people who are skeptical, who can challenge you to keep you on track.
Yeah, for checks and balances.
That's correct.
Yeah.
Yes.
Jack, according to the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, over 300,000 Americans have died from opioid addiction since the late 1990s. Atlantic Magazine reports, and I'll quote, in 2012, there were 793 million doses of opioids prescribed just in the state of Ohio, enough to supply every man, woman, and child with 68 pills each. Clearly, too many doctors are prescribing too many doses, too many pharmacies fill too many prescriptions, and so on and so forth. Yet, in a recent congressional hearing, most of the executives being grilled, told the lawmakers that they weren't to blame for fanning this crisis. You know, I've always wondered why didn't somebody do something about this? I think they all see this massive healthcare system as a huge ATM kiosk that they can tap for as many dollars as they want, whenever they want to, without ignoring while they're ignoring any sense of responsibility to follow the Hippocratic oath of first do no harm. Out of the tens of thousands of corporate executives and medical professionals, why have none stood up to the industry and shouted, "Stop! We're killing our fellow citizens"? So Jack, how does an entire, very large and successful industry with a fairly complicated supply chain not take any responsibility for this massive healthcare problem?
Well, haven't we been here before? I mean, you may remember over 20 years ago, the top 7 tobacco executives stood in front of Congress and all said, you know, they're not responsible and their product is not addictive. So this is really a supply chain problem. And normally in supply chains, when something happens that's really good or something that happens really bad, typically there's one company that's really the one who catalyzes the change. Sometimes that doesn't happen, but most times it does. In this case, there was one company that was at the forefront and the epicenter of this problem. And that company's name is Purdue Pharma. So the opioid crisis began in the mid-90s. In 1995, Purdue Pharma got approval with the FDA for a drug called OxyContin. And they actually duped the FDA into having the FDA agree that this pain medication was a time-release medication, which it wasn't, which was the fraud that they committed. Their first year's sales was $45 million. That was 1995. The year 2000, their sales were $1 billion. And by the year 2010, their sales were $3.1 billion. That's a massive fraud. Well, how did this happen? You know, how did this one company sell the pills in this proliferated manner? Well, you have to understand who the people are behind Purdue Pharma. There's a family called the Sackler family who owns Purdue Pharma. And if you know anything about pharmaceutical marketing, Arthur Sackler, who's the patriarch of the family, was the one who started the way that pharmaceutical companies marketed to doctors, you know, wined and dined doctors, put together workshops explaining why pills were safe. He did that a long time ago with Librium and Valium. And this was the same show that they did with OxyContin. So they would wine and dine the doctors. They would put on workshops talking about, you know, there was no problems with addiction of this drug. The time release process worked, you know, paying for doctor speeches and everything like that. So this company was actually fraudulent. They paid $75 million in fines for their first lawsuit. There's some out there. They actually pleaded guilty to a term called criminal misbranding, which seems, you know, much nicer than what actually really happened. And this family is worth $13 billion, with most of their gains happening with this recent drug. So this is clearly a bad actor. But your question, Dan, was, well, why didn't anybody else step up in the supply chain? So there were the distributors of the drugs and the retailers of the drugs, and these would be companies like McKesson and CVS, a distributor and retailer. And while you could say that if a doctor gives a prescription, you know, you fill it, that doesn't answer these large swings and variations in the numbers that you were mentioning of how pills were just being dumped in communities. They should have systems that should be able to control that for sure. Then there's the role of the doctors. You mentioned the Hippocratic Oath. How did the doctors stay out of this, and why were they complicit? Actually, Purdue Pharma focused on doctors who weren't experts at pain medication, and they were the easier prey. But they are still obligated to serve the patient first. They made a lot of money on that. I find it strange that there's no such thing as conflict of interest in the medical community like we face in corporate America. There should be, I think, stronger state laws regarding conflict of interest when it comes to that. And there's also these patient advocacy groups that were also complicit in this. And there was a survey done that 66% of patient advocacy groups received money from this company. And they funded their associations from anywhere to 12 to like 75% of their associations were funded by these pharmaceutical companies. So the whole supply chain broke down, and this was very unfortunate.
I'm going to just ask you a question, play a little bit of the devil's advocate here. I appreciate your analogy to the tobacco industry. If we look at tobacco, though, people have a choice whether to smoke or not, and I think that's what the tobacco industry was saying. And so did users of these pills have a choice? And they are the ones that could say, no, I'm not going to do this.
They had a choice, but it was not an informed choice. So if a patient was at their doctor's office and a doctor is seen in high regard for their care, and the doctor said, oh, I'm going to prescribe this pain medication and make you feel better, I think most people would listen to their doctor and go with that.
So does that get back to the issue that we were talking about in regards to Facebook and transparency? So who has the responsibility to be very transparent? This can be an addictive product.
Well, I think the whole supply chain does, but to the patient it would be the doctor. To the manufacturer it would be the distributor and the retailer, and that's where the whole thing broke down. To Dan's question, why didn't anybody stand up and say something? There were so many opportunities for this to be addressed before 300,000 Americans passed away.
Well, I think we can see in this example, as well as in the Facebook example, capitalism, rampantly practiced, and then saying that, well, the patient has a choice, but then you're absolutely right. If that medication helps you, and especially if you're in pain, then you forget that it could become addictive, because at that moment it's giving you relief. And of course you are depending on the good advice, medical advice that you're getting from the doctor, not knowing what's happening in the back. And so you're absolutely right. It's a terrible crisis that we've come to, and we need to do something about it. But who is responsible? Whose responsibility is it?
It's everybody's in that business's responsibility, in my view. Periodically these things happen, and my immediate reaction is to be angry because nobody stepped up and said, I can stop this, and we need to stop this. And it's just a total lack of accountability or responsibility for the trust we put into these companies, and the resources they've got, and the smart people they've got. They could have stopped this thing in a second.
So one thing that you mentioned I think needs to be addressed is as a corporate, so this is a conversation about an ethics review. So when they lined up, you mentioned the congressional hearing, when they lined up the 5 distributors, and they asked them, is your company complicit in this? The 7 big tobacco companies all said they weren't. Actually, one of the 5 distributors said that they were. But they're being asked a legal question. So as a corporate executive, you have to ask yourself an ethical question, right? And I think that was the missing point in all of these companies, that none of the executives had an ethical dilemma with what happened.
And so a question I have, you mentioned tobacco, and now we have this opioid. It's going to happen again, just somewhere. How do we, what should be put into place to stop this type of thing?
Well, one answer that you'll hear industry talk about is this technology called blockchain, which is a technology that is an electronic ledger that can keep track of it. And I think that's fantastic, but I don't think that's going to solve the problem of executive irresponsibility. I think that there'll always be people who will find ways to make money. So I think that can help prevent it, some of it, but it will not eliminate it.
You know, my suspicion is too. There are a lot of weak spines sitting around boardroom tables. They had the power and the opportunity to cause these companies to stop doing this stuff. And these big distributors, they know exactly how many pills went where. They don't need blockchain for that. You know, all they do is turn their computer on. They know, 4 million pills went to Joe's Pharmacy in nowhere, West Virginia. And that should have told them something that they didn't want to know, maybe. I think it's just a terrible situation, and I wish there was something that somebody outside the industry could do. And I'm not suggesting legislation either, although that's what's going to happen. It ought to come from inside the industry.
And that's what happened with tobacco. There was legislation that was put into place. And so is this always what's going to be to break the cycle, is that we have to have legislation come in. And so, that goes back to, where does ethics fall into corporate America and these types of issues?
Well, I would say it's more than just an ethics thing. It's a responsibility thing. I mean, these people are American citizens, the people running these big businesses, and it doesn't seem to bother them at all that they're killing millions of their fellow citizens in this process.
But in fairness, this drug was sold as a time-release drug. And so the people who manufactured it defrauded the entire supply chain. So the distributors and the retailers and even the doctors would say, well, I didn't know about that until it was too late.
Well, I'll bet there's a lot of people outside the Purdue family who could have figured that out pretty quick, and probably did figure it out pretty quick.
Well, I think you're right. I think there's a history of opioids, right? How long have they been around, and how long have we known about this being a problem?
Well, anyway, thanks for the conversation. I don't feel a lot better. Thanks anyway. In 2003, a young lady named Elizabeth Holmes founded a new company based on a brand new but totally untested technology for testing blood samples. Now, this is a $70 billion market. Her company, Theranos, claimed their technology could perform a large number of blood tests using a very small sample of blood, somewhere between 1/100th and 1/1000th of the conventional amount of blood that was required. These claims were made with no peer-reviewed research, with no documented findings. Yet they were able to convince a large number of very sophisticated investors on the strength of their business model, to the degree that in 2013 and 2014, Theranos could claim a valuation of $9 billion. And Ms. Holmes a net worth of $4.5 billion. In April 2016, it was reported that the company was under criminal investigation by federal prosecutors in the Securities and Exchange Commission for allegedly misleading investors and government officials about its technology. On March 14th, 2018, just a few weeks ago, the SEC charged Ms. Holmes with widespread fraud, and without admitting or denying the allegation, Ms. Holmes agreed to a $500,000 fine, which seems a pittance to me. So Vi, you've been studying this situation for some time now. Let me ask you a simple question. How does a charming 23-year-old Stanford dropout get away with a stunning $800 million fraud for some 15 years?
Well, you
Well,
got the
first,
answer.
what allowed her to believe that what she was doing was okay?
Well, that's a fascinating case study in personality and ethics. And I think, Dan, that you had the answer. She was very charming. She had a brilliant marketing mind and connections. And she leveraged those two to create this big illusion that she was about to change the world with this radical technology. And sure enough, the combination of intelligence, charm, wit, and the ability to actually bring in big names into the company's marketing campaign, I think actually made investors very naive. And I don't know how one could invest hundreds of millions of dollars without asking for what is being done with that money and how is it being spent, because as a privately held company, I learned from the reports that she did not ever hire any auditor to produce audited financial statements. Well, is it her mistake? No, because she was not being asked to. Nobody demanded that, obviously, for years. So she could get away with it. And also, I must add that probably there was an element of unbounded optimism that, yes, this one test, one more test, and I'm close to getting the FDA approval. And so you again use that as an incentive to go seek out more money. But in this case, you are seeking hundreds of millions of dollars. And there were no checks and balances. But everybody fell for her charm. And she had this perfect excuse to say that, I'm still trying to change the world. Wait a minute. Give me a few more days, a few more weeks, a few more months. And that became a few more years, until some investors sort of thought that maybe there is fraud here.
So, Dan, you asked, how could she personally think that this was okay to do? And I've worked with a lot of entrepreneurs. I myself have been an entrepreneur, and you have to believe in yourself. If you come up against a roadblock, it's not working today, but being optimistic, it's going to work tomorrow. I'm sure it has to work because you believe in yourself. You have to believe in yourself. And that's, I think, what was happening with her. So it wasn't a matter of her saying, oh, it's okay for me to defraud these people. It was, I believe in what I'm doing. I am going to change the healthcare system. And that gets back to our opiate issue, is that we know that the healthcare system in the United States is broken. And here is this young, charming, intelligent woman who says, I can make a difference in this small piece of it. And so the investors are going to say, I believe you, you can do that. You are our future. She herself had to have believed that was the case also. I am going to make a difference.
In fact, to your point, there was an MSNBC segment when she was at the peak of her popularity. They showed a little napkin on which she had written as a 9-year-old as to how she wanted to make a difference and change the world. And I'm sure she believed in that. However, as she got deeper and deeper in debt, I think there was something that was lost, where optimism is great, but then how can you scientifically prove something that again and again is not being proven?
Go ahead.
Let me ask a question, because I think we're in violent agreement, so it's time to change it. So it's clear, right? She's 23 years old. She got $800 million. She can't even rent a car at an airport. How did this happen? So I think we all agree that she tried to change the world. She's very intelligent. I was going to say exactly what you said. I was looking at some YouTube videos. You watch her; she believes everything she's saying.
Yes.
Her whole life, she's been able to outthink things, and just next week she's got the answer. She's always. It seems like she's the type of person who could do that. So, what happened here? What happened?
I think that at a certain point in time, people who have unbounded optimism, if there are no checks and balances, that they get sucked into it. And once you're sucked into it, then the vicious cycle begins, and you start believing that you could do anything even though that is not possible.
Don't talk about her anymore. Talk about, because we all agree on that.
Yeah.
Talk about where the whole governance broke down on an $800 million investment.
So that's really what my question is. So we know it was the Walton family, and what did they throw in? 150 million.
Yes.
And Murdoch had another, 100+ million.
Yeah.
And these are savvy investments. These are just not your average person. So yeah, back to your question, Jack. How does that happen?
Go ahead, Dan.
And there are some very sophisticated venture capitalists in here with huge investments in there, and these guys are supposed to be fairly skeptical about stuff.
Yeah. Yes. Yeah.
I think they just drank too much of their own Kool-Aid.
Yeah, and also, the estimates that were produced by the business model, the founders, are staggering. And sure, yes, if the technology is there, all that can happen. But the fundamental problem was with the technology. And the company claims they have 1,000 and odd, patents or patents in process all over the world. And they're using that to feed the marketing machine.
But how did the audits get missed in the medical community? How did the peer review analysis? I mean, how did those things get missed?
Just going back to your earlier question, is it greed? These
Yeah.
big investors, because medical is broken, here's a way that we're going to be able to fix it, and I want to be in early on.
Right.
This was a privately owned company, owned mostly by venture capitalists and wealthy families. There was a board of directors, which had no business people on it.
Yes.
George Schultz's grandson was a connection to Miss Holmes, and so she asked him to join the board, and he went and got all his pals from Washington, William Perry and James Timmis, the general recently retired. And so nobody knew what they were doing, and these venture capitalists didn't have the guts to stand up and say this is wrong, and they just liquidated their holdings and walked away. It's not a very responsible thing to do.
Yeah, and we do hope that there's a pending class action lawsuit that, of course, Theranos is trying to have it dismissed, of indirect investors. But there are also reports that Ms. Holmes herself used to monitor these indirect investors. So it's going to be a very interesting drama that unfolds to see actually how does SEC now send a signal, a strong signal to young potential entrepreneur that you've got to do the right things. This is not going to be the last one. We've seen before how very rich, savvy investors, get into problems when they start believing, somebody they know personally. You see, that personal connection sometimes does the problem. However, it's a very interesting case study actually to see how the legal proceedings would unfold and what kind of message that the SEC would send. In fact, the SEC made comments saying that we want to send a strong message to young entrepreneurs from the Silicon Valley, and that this is not possible. Fraud is not one of the things that you're going to do. However, SEC admits that private companies don't have to file audited financial statements. So maybe that will change unless they are seeking debt. You see? And so some of these may change in the future, but it is definitely a very sad story.
Well, I think it's also a commentary on Silicon Valley generally, because I think that whole community out there has a fairly loose relationship with truth, honesty, and the American way. Supermarket or Superman or somebody said it at one time.
I think what Rosanna said makes a lot of sense. It's a great idea. Everybody wants to get in quick, so haste, be the first ones in, make the most money, right?
And you have to stand up as an entrepreneur, and you go back to Silicon Valley, and you know, and I've operated in that world. And so, is it lies or is it optimism?
Well, you know, does the name Kirk Hansen ring a bell to you?
No.
This is the guy who ran the Markkula Center for Applied Ethics at Santa Clara University, and he ran the business ethics piece of it. He ran the whole thing, really. He had a piece in the Wall Street Journal a couple of years ago, where he's reporting out on the results of a relatively informal survey of venture capitalists. And the question was, should an entrepreneur lie? Should they lie to their investors? Should they lie to their customers? Should they lie to their employees? And he actually thought it was a good question to ask. Like, maybe it's okay. And he's a recognized ethicist.
And it is that optimistic viewpoint. Again, I have to believe that I'm going to be successful because there are so many hurdles there that says you are not going to be successful. And so I have to have the optimism. And, you know, that goes, is it lies or not? Or is it protecting your employees from the truth and really what's behind? And there have been many, many companies that are on their way down, and then all of a sudden, and it's luck. Everybody does say there's a component of luck in entrepreneurship, that the luck takes off and you've got these big successful companies. So I'm wondering, go back to our question that we had with Facebook, is it an issue of transparency? You know, when does a company and a founder need to be transparent about what's really happening? That often will scare away the investors. It will scare away employees if they knew the real truth about what is happening in the company. So, you know, does one tell a lie but be optimistic? And it goes back to it. She believed in what she was doing. And there are those charming people that make you believe too. They know what they're doing.
Well, I could say the Boston Strangler believed in what he was doing too.
Yeah. Yes.
I mean, it's not enough that they believe it. It's got to be a good thing to do.
But was she doing anything illegal?
Wasn't there cases of her she was like telling her people not to talk? I mean, she was really a tight ship on that whole thing.
Yes. There was actually a letter that was published by BuzzFeed, and where the letter was to the shareholders, and she was cautioning that, you know, no information get out. But of course, you know, that's what people are going to do, since they do want to have some control about what goes out into the public. However, you know, all these three cases, Dan, that you picked actually boil down to due diligence, isn't it? When we have prominent investors put in hundreds of billions of dollars and let the entrepreneur run with that without asking questions, the entrepreneur feels empowered to do it, right? So that's where we have, who has to send a message? You know, how can you give hundreds of millions of dollars without asking what is being done and what is being accomplished? What are the milestones?
I would imagine that the capital managers of the Walton family and the Cox family and the Murdoch family got a pretty good message out of this one.
And I hope future entrepreneurs get this message, right? As well as future investors. You know, when I asked this question in my class, how many people would believe and react to this? I feel that the youngsters, in the social media age, who are used to Facebook especially, and not thinking twice about what could happen to their information, say, oh, yeah, we trust them. When these are going to be our future investors, our future entrepreneurs. And so, hey, in the business schools, at least in my class, we talk a lot about due diligence.
Oh, good. That's a good conversation to have at that age.